I used to believe that peace was something you earned. After years of running a small logistics company, raising my daughter on my own, and finally paying off the mortgage on the little two-story brick home I loved, I thought I had earned the right to exhale. The house sat near the edge of Silver Pines, one of those quiet suburban developments where mailboxes matched and lawns seemed to grow in uniform rhythm, all under the ever-watchful eye of the Homeowners Association. I didn't mind the HOA at first. Truth be told, it felt safe, predictable, controlled. That's what I was chasing when I moved here, after retiring early just enough structure to keep chaos at bay. It was late spring when the first envelope arrived. I remember the exact day, because the scent of blooming magnolias lingered on the wind, and I had just come in from watering the hedges. I almost didn't notice the envelope wedged in the doorframe, not the mailbox. That's always a bad sign. HOA notices delivered by hand tend to mean business. I peeled it open slowly, expecting something minor, a notice about trash bins left out too long or the mailbox needing fresh paint. Instead, I found a formal citation for repeated violations of community standards, citing excessive lawn overgrowth and failure to adhere to home appearance regulations. I blinked at the page. My lawn had been mowed just 3 days prior, and I'd repainted the shutters myself in February. It made no sense. I flipped the page over, searching for photos or specifics, nothing. Just vague language and a warning that non-compliance could result in daily fines up to $150. I didn't panic. Not then. I took a breath, walked back outside, and snapped a few photos of my yard. It was pristine, better than most. I called the HOA office, got an answering machine, and left a polite but firm message asking for clarification. That night, I sent an email with photo attachments. I went to bed annoyed but not yet afraid. 3 days passed. Then another letter came, this time certified. It claimed that because I had not corrected the issue, I was now being fined $450. And worse, that the issue had escalated into a potential breach of residency standards. That was the first time I saw the word eviction nestled like a thorn in the text. I stared at the word so long it blurred. I didn't understand. I had lived there for 6 years, never once late on dues, never caused trouble. My daughter Carla had moved out last fall for college, and since then I'd lived quietly, keeping to myself. I went to HOA meetings when I could, mostly to listen. I had no enemies that I knew of, so why now? Why me? That night I couldn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table with the letter spread out in front of me, reading every line like it was a riddle. I didn't yet know that the HOA had a pattern going after certain homeowners, quietly, slowly bleeding them with citations and fees until they sold or gave up. I didn't yet know that I was just the next checkmark in someone's strategy. All I knew was that something felt wrong. Deeply wrong. I went to the next HOA meeting, hoping for a rational explanation. The room was sterile, fluorescent lights and folding chairs arranged in a circle. Karen Bellamy, the HOA president, sat in the center like a queen holding court, her pearl necklace shining like a badge. I waited patiently, then raised my hand. "Hi, I live on Oakmere Lane, number 324. I received a citation about..." She cut me off with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Sir, violations are handled through official correspondence. We won't be discussing individual infractions in a public forum." I frowned. "But I've emailed, called, no one's responding." Karen gave a delicate shrug. "Then perhaps you need to review the guidelines more carefully." That was the moment I saw it, the slight nod she gave to the man beside her, Derek, the HOA compliance officer. His smirk said everything. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was personal, and I had no idea why. I left that meeting shaken. It was the first time I felt the edges of fear gnawing at me. Not just for myself, but for how easily someone could be pushed quietly, systematically out of their home. A week later, I woke to find a bright orange notice taped to my front door. Final warning. It listed a new violation: improper storage of materials in public view. I stepped outside and saw what they meant. My garden hose was coiled by the side gate, same place it always had been. This was no longer about rules. This was harassment. I began documenting everything. Every letter, every visit, every conversation. I bought a binder and labeled it HOA Nonsense. Though I stopped thinking of it as nonsense after the third notice mentioned legal removal due to non-compliance. I started keeping my phone nearby at all times, just in case someone came by when I wasn't expecting them. Then came the day I found two strangers walking around my backyard. They wore HOA badges, but hadn't knocked. I only saw them because I caught the motion through the kitchen window while making coffee. I ran outside, my voice sharp. "What are you doing in my yard?" The taller man glanced at his clipboard. "We're documenting landscape violations. On private property. This area is within community jurisdiction." I didn't yell. I just stared at them with a quiet fury that made them both take a step back. After they left, I locked the side gate and called the sheriff's non-emergency line. The dispatcher was kind but said unless there was clear trespassing with damage, there wasn't much they could do. The HOA had certain permissions depending on the bylaws. I hung up, feeling more alone than ever. I thought about calling my cousin Nathan. He and I had grown up close, though his world was now filled with courtrooms and press conferences. As state attorney, he carried weight, real weight. But I wasn't ready yet. A part of me still hoped this would resolve quietly, that someone on the board would come to their senses. Instead, they doubled down. 2 weeks later, I received a formal notice of eviction proceedings, citing accumulated non-compliance and community disruption. That's when the fear became something else, something colder, harder. Resolve. The morning after I received the eviction notice, I sat at my kitchen table staring at the envelope like it was a bomb that had already gone off. The paper was thick, the kind that makes an impact just by how it feels in your hand. The letter was filled with legalese citing obscure bylaws from the HOA charter, and it listed a breakdown of fines that totaled just under $4,200. They claimed the amount was now recoverable by lien or eviction proceedings. I remember the way my fingers trembled as I traced the words. It wasn't just a warning anymore. It was a declaration of war. I spent the next 2 hours reading every document I had ever received from the HOA. I dug up the community agreement I signed 6 years ago when I moved into Silver Pines. I highlighted every clause they referenced, searching for loopholes or inconsistencies. And though I'm not a lawyer, I've always had a head for detail. Decades running my logistics firm taught me to spot red flags before they became disasters. And there they were: inconsistencies, contradictions, and vague language used in the HOA's favor. What struck me most was how some of the violations they accused me of didn't exist in the charter at all. No rule about hoses, no specifics on shrub height, nothing about temporary storage near the fence line. I printed everything. I created folders. I took photos of my property from every angle, time-stamped and annotated. I wasn't just defending my home, I was preparing for battle. The next strike came in the form of a lien. It arrived 5 days later, filed with the county clerk. I found out not through a formal notice, but from a friend in real estate who had access to public property records. He texted me out of the blue. "Hey, did you know there's a lien on your house? Everything okay?" I nearly dropped my phone. When I confirmed it, my stomach turned. Filing a lien meant they were serious. It meant they could legally freeze the value of my home, obstruct refinancing or sales, and apply pressure until I cracked. That evening, I saw the HOA president, Karen Bellamy, walking her dog. She paused near my driveway and gave me a little smile, something in between smugness and warning. I don't know what came over me, but I walked out onto the lawn and asked plainly, "Why are you doing this?" She tilted her head. "We're simply enforcing the standards everyone agreed to." But that's not true. You've invented half these citations. There are no rules about hoses or one-time trash bins, or, Karen's voice hardened, "You're becoming disruptive. That's a violation in itself. I've lived here quietly for years, and now you're not." She looked me dead in the eye. "Maybe Silver Pines isn't the right community for you anymore." She turned and walked away. The rage I felt was unlike anything I'd known before. Not just because she was targeting me, but because she believed she could without question, without consequence. I decided that night I wasn't going to be quiet anymore. I started talking to neighbors. At first, they were hesitant. People in neighborhoods like ours don't like drama. They mow their lawns, keep their blinds half closed, and attend barbecues where everyone talks about weather and school test scores. But when I mentioned the fines and the liens, something changed in their eyes. One couple down the street had paid nearly $3,000 over 2 years for exterior noise disturbances, which turned out to be their grandson, visiting with a guitar once a week. Another elderly man, George, had nearly lost his home over late fees he said he never received notifications for. The pattern was clear. The HOA targeted homeowners who lived alone, who didn't have the energy or support to fight back, who wouldn't be missed at the meetings when they disappeared. I compiled a list of names and phone numbers, people who were willing to speak at least off the record. I recorded their statements. I documented their notices. I asked for permission to include them in a portfolio I was putting together, just in case this goes legal, I said. It was around this time I began receiving anonymous letters. They were slipped under my door or taped inside my mailbox. No return address, no signature, just typed messages on plain white paper. The first read, "You don't know what you're up against. Walk away." The second came a week later. "You're not just fighting Karen. She's protected. Think carefully." It scared me. Not because I thought they'd hurt me physically, but because I realized this went deeper than Karen's obsession with control. She had connections. Maybe someone in the city clerk's office. Maybe someone in real estate development with plans for the land beneath our homes. I had no proof yet, but the timing of the lien, the harassment, the sudden urgency to remove me, it all pointed to something bigger than a garden hose. And that's when I made the call. Nathan hadn't heard from me in over a year, not since the last family reunion. He was state attorney now, busy, respected, constantly on the move. But when he answered and heard my voice shake, he didn't hesitate. "Talk to me," he said. I laid it all out, every letter, every fine, every incident of trespass and intimidation. I told him about Karen, the lien, the anonymous threats. He went quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want you to scan every document and send it to me. Tonight. Don't talk to anyone else about this, not yet." That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at the desk for hours, scanning every page, organizing every folder. I wrote a statement detailing the timeline of events. I included the names of neighbors who had agreed to be witnesses. When I finally hit send, it felt like handing over a lifeline. Not just for me, but for everyone they had bullied into silence. The next morning, Nathan called. "I ran a check," he said. "This isn't the first time Karen Bellamy's name has come up, but it might be the last." Nathan's words echoed in my ears long after the call ended. This might be the last. It was the first moment in weeks that I allowed myself to believe I might not only survive this, but win. I wasn't naive enough to think it would be easy. I had lived long enough to know the legal system moved like molasses uphill, and HOA boards were notorious for burying people in bureaucracy until they gave up. But Nathan was different. He wasn't just an attorney. He was the state attorney. And if he said there was a history to Karen Bellamy, I was ready to help uncover every inch of it. Except I didn't know that before justice takes its first swing, humiliation often lands the opening blow. 3 days after my call with Nathan, I came home from the grocery store to find a neon orange notice nailed to my front door. Notice of community removal initiated. Not taped, not placed in an envelope, nailed. The kind of thing they do when they want to make a public example out of someone. The neighbors saw it. An older woman walking her dachshund paused and stared. A teenager on a bike slowed down. Across the street, I saw blinds shift just a sliver, just enough. It was like being stripped in the town square. No trial, no defense, just a verdict nailed into wood for everyone to witness. I yanked it down, hands shaking. I read it twice. They were claiming I was actively destabilizing the integrity of the neighborhood, that I had become a risk to communal harmony. And then the line that turned my stomach. Pursuant to Article 6, Section 14 of Silver Pine's Covenant, the board has the authority to initiate emergency eviction measures if homeowner behavior is deemed egregiously disruptive. That clause wasn't in the copy of the HOA charter I signed. And then I understood. They had amended the rules, quietly. Probably in a closed-door meeting I wasn't invited to, or one that had no official minutes. They had rewritten the law to fit their target, to fit me. Nathan's voice came back to me again. Document everything. So I took photos. I recorded a video narrating as I showed the front door, the holes from the nails, the language of the notice. I scanned the paper and added it to the folder. Then I sat down and began writing an email to the HOA, demanding a copy of the updated charter and proof of community vote approving the amendment. They never responded. Instead, the retaliation escalated. 2 days later, a truck arrived, unannounced, flatbed rusting with 2 men in gray coveralls who claimed they were sent to assess property compliance for removal readiness. I told them to get off my land. They didn't argue. They just nodded and said, "We'll report non-cooperation." That same evening, my mailbox was left open with the door ripped off its hinge. The next morning, I found dead grass clippings dumped across my driveway in a deliberate even pattern, just enough to stain the concrete, but not enough to count as vandalism. Psychological warfare in suburbia. And then came the HOA meeting. I wasn't going to attend. I hadn't missed one in months, but after everything, I didn't think I could sit in that cold community center again, surrounded by forced smiles and folded arms. But Nathan called me that morning. "You need to go," he said. "Let them play their hand in front of people and record everything." So I went, dressed plainly, brought my binder and my phone with a lapel mic clipped under my jacket. I arrived early and sat in the back, unnoticed at first. Karen stood at the front of the room leading the meeting with her usual syrupy tone until she saw me. Her eyes narrowed. "Oh, Mr. Delaney. Didn't expect you'd show tonight." I said nothing, just nodded. The meeting proceeded with the usual neighborhood updates, repainting the pool gate, upcoming spring festival landscaping budget. Then Karen's tone shifted. "We've had an unfortunate situation arise involving one of our residents who has repeatedly failed to comply with the guidelines that protect our community's integrity." Every head turned toward me. Karen didn't say my name, but she didn't have to. She gestured vaguely in my direction and pulled a file from her folder. "This homeowner has racked up over $4,000 in violations and has aggressively resisted our efforts to resolve matters amicably." I stood up. "Excuse me," I said calmly. "I'd like to respond." Karen's smile vanished. "This isn't a debate forum, Mr. Delaney. I've been a resident here for 6 years. I've never missed a payment. I've never damaged property. I've never endangered anyone. And yet I've been fined for made-up violations, denied responses to formal inquiries, and threatened with removal from a home I own outright." Murmurs rose around the room. Karen tried to speak, but I raised my voice, not shouting, just sharp enough to cut through. "And now the HOA has nailed public eviction notices to my door and sent unauthorized workers to harass me. If this is your version of community, I think the rest of the residents deserve to know exactly how decisions are being made." Several neighbors nodded. One woman even said, "Wait, they nailed something to your house." Karen stepped forward. "He's being dramatic." I pulled out my phone. "Would anyone like to see the video?" Silence. Karen's face froze like someone caught mid-lie and unsure whether to double down or retreat. I didn't push further. I just sat back down. The meeting ended 5 minutes later in awkward silence, and several people came up to me afterward. Whispered support, shared stories, promised to email me their own violations that had felt off. But the damage was done. The next day, the HOA sent a formal letter revoking my community privileges, banning me from meetings, pool access, and park use. As if the neighborhood amenities mattered more than the roof over my head. It was the equivalent of social exile. Public shaming disguised as policy. I didn't care. They had shown their hand, and now it was time for mine. Because what Karen and her board didn't know, what they still didn't know, was that every move they made had been quietly documented, that each letter had already been submitted to the state attorney's office, that every conversation, every veiled threat, every falsified violation was now part of an active investigation. They still thought I was just another old man, too proud or tired to fight back. They had no idea I had blood ties to the one man in this state they absolutely shouldn't have crossed. And Nathan Caldwell was just getting started. I wish I could say I handled everything with unshakable calm, that I slept well, that I went about my life with defiance and a clear conscience. But that wouldn't be honest. The truth is that week broke something in me. I didn't cry, not outwardly at least, but there were nights when I sat in the dark staring at the walls of my living room, feeling like a ghost in my own home. It's a strange thing being made to feel like you don't belong in a place you've built your life around. That house wasn't just a structure. It held Carla's height marks on the kitchen doorway, the worn groove in the hallway floor where I paced during long calls, the garden I planted after her high school graduation. Every room carried a piece of me, and now every room also carried the sense that someone else wanted me out. But no matter how cornered I felt, something deep in my chest refused to surrender. I've known loss before. My wife passed away when Carla was 8. I've been the only parent, the only comfort, the only steady hand she had. I've buried parents, walked away from a business I built from nothing, and rebuilt myself more times than I care to count. So if the HOA thought they could scare me into walking away quietly, they didn't understand who they were dealing with. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I stopped bringing in the mail through the front door because I didn't want to look at the new notices posted almost daily. Instead, I entered through the garage. But I stayed. Karen escalated her tactics as expected. I began receiving daily compliance, patrol visits Derek or some new smug-faced recruit, circling my home with clipboards, snapping photos, whispering into radios. My trash can was moved to the middle of my driveway every morning, no matter where I left it. Landscaping trucks idled just across the street, with no work in sight, just drivers watching. One morning, I found a new sign staked into my front yard. This property is under review for non-compliance. Big bold HOA issued, like a scarlet letter for the neighborhood to see. I tore it out and threw it into my garage like a spear. Later that day, I got a voicemail from Nathan. His tone was different, more focused. The investigation's moving forward. We've found financial inconsistencies in the HOA's operating budget, missing invoices, contracts issued to shell companies with no tax records. If we can tie those to Karen or her board, we're talking felony charges. I exhaled slowly. Do they know you're involved yet? No, he said. And keep it that way. Let them keep thinking they've got you beat. That night, I installed motion sensor lights around the perimeter of the house. I set up a dash cam in my truck and pointed a GoPro at my front door, recording 24/7. If they wanted a fight, I'd give them one, and I'd record every second of it. But the hardest moment came not from them, but from Carla. She called after her evening class, sounding exhausted. Dad, I got a call from someone on the HOA board. My heart dropped. They told me you were being evicted, that you're refusing to leave, and the situation's becoming dangerous. Is that true? I clenched my jaw. What exactly did they say? That you've become unwell. That you're harassing neighbors, refusing safety checks. They made it sound like an intervention was needed. I sat in silence for a long time. Carla, I said gently, do you think I'd ever do something to put you or this home in danger? No, she whispered. But why are they going after you? Because I didn't roll over. I explained everything carefully, methodically. The citations, the threats, the lien, the harassment, Nathan's involvement, the investigation. I didn't tell her everything about the stress I'd been under, about the nights I woke up gasping, or the weight loss I hadn't mentioned. She didn't need that burden. By the end of the call, her voice was steadier. Do you want me to come home? No, I said softer. I want you to live your life. Finish your semester. I've got this. And I did. Because somewhere between the fear and the fury, I had found a strange clarity. I didn't have to defeat them with fists or rage. I just had to outlast them. I had to let their arrogance lead them straight into the trap of their own making. So I stayed. I kept my lawn trimmed with ruler precision. I scrubbed the mailbox until it gleamed. I placed cameras where they were visible enough to make a statement. When the compliance officers walked by, I waved. And all the while, Nathan worked behind the scenes like a surgeon. He requested bank records, internal memos, email logs between board members. He subpoenaed Karen's personal real estate dealings. He combed through every citation issued over the past 2 years and compared them against amendments that hadn't been properly voted on. And then one day, he called me with something that nearly knocked the breath from my lungs. They're targeting you because your property is in a planned redevelopment corridor, he said. A developer approached the board last year with a buyout offer for your street. Most of the homes were already under negotiation except yours. You were the only holdout. My grip tightened on the phone. They used violations and fabricated fines as a tactic to force you into selling. And Karen, I asked, my voice thin, owned stock in the developer's company, shell corporations, hidden through layers, but we traced it. There it was, the real reason behind everything. Greed wrapped in bylaws. Corruption masked as community standards. And I was the wrench in the machine. I sat on my porch that night, sipping cold coffee, staring at the garden I planted 6 springs ago. Every rosebush, every patch of mulch, every bird feeder Carla helped hang it was all still mine. And I wasn't going anywhere. Let them knock. Let them circle. Let them glare from across the street. I refused to leave. It happened on a Wednesday afternoon, a day so ordinary it almost caught me off guard. The air was thick with the scent of sun-baked asphalt, and I'd just come in from trimming the hedges when I heard the knock. It wasn't timid. It wasn't friendly. It was the kind of knock that demanded compliance. I opened the door to find Karen Bellamy standing on my porch. She wore a crisp linen blazer despite the heat and carried a thick manila folder under one arm. Her face carefully maintained with too much foundation, and not enough warmth curled into a smile that didn't belong anywhere near the word sincere. Beside her stood Derek, the HOA compliance officer, trying to look official, but sweating through his polo like a man who didn't want to be there. Karen didn't wait for an invitation. She stepped forward slightly, just enough to cross the invisible line of personal space. "Mr. Delaney," she said, as if we were neighbors exchanging pleasantries. We thought we might stop by to have a friendly, off-the-record conversation. I raised an eyebrow. "Is that what this is?" Her smile twitched. "May we come in?" "No," I said, leaning against the doorframe. "Whatever you have to say, you can say it right here." For a moment, she hesitated. Then she nodded and opened the folder. "We've compiled a summary of your non-compliance 27 recorded incidents over the past 8 weeks. This includes landscape violations, hostile communication with HOA staff, unauthorized security installations, and failure to respond to corrective action notices." "Unauthorized security installations," I repeated deadpan. "You mean the motion lights and cameras on my own home?" "It's disruptive," she said. "Your behavior has created an atmosphere of tension among neighbors." I almost laughed. "You mean they're finally starting to see what you really are?" Her face hardened, and for a brief second, the mask slipped. She wasn't here to discuss. She was here to deliver an ultimatum. Karen looked at Derek, then back to me. "If you voluntarily agree to vacate the property by the end of this month, we can waive the outstanding fines and remove the lien." I stared at her. "You want me to leave my home so you can sell it to a developer?" Her expression didn't change, but the flinch in her left eye gave her away. "You're standing on my porch, offering to erase a punishment you created in exchange for my silence and surrender. You don't have to make this harder than it needs to be," she said quietly. "There are other methods we can pursue. Legal ones." I leaned in just slightly. "Karen, are you aware that the state attorney's office has opened an active investigation into your board's financial misconduct?" She froze. Derek turned to her, slowly, confusion written all over his face. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice suddenly brittle. "What did you just say?" I replied calm and clear. "You may want to consult a lawyer before showing up on someone's doorstep uninvited and making veiled threats. Because this conversation, it's being recorded. And you just tried to coerce a homeowner into abandoning legal property under pressure." Her mouth parted slightly, a tremor of panic behind her teeth. "You're bluffing." I stepped back into the foyer, picked up my phone from the hallway table, and turned the screen toward her. It displayed a running timer. 15 minutes and 22 seconds, I said. "Would you like a copy emailed to your attorney?" Karen's face drained of color. Derek looked like he wanted to disappear. "I suggest you leave now," I said, "before this visit becomes part of the public record." For one suspended moment, we stood there, me the stubborn homeowner they couldn't shake, and her the queen of a crumbling HOA empire, who finally realized her throne wasn't untouchable. She spun on her heel and stormed off the porch, Derek stumbling after her. The screen door shut behind them with a satisfying click. I stood in the hallway, my heart pounding. I wasn't shaking, not anymore. Not from fear, but from adrenaline. From knowing the tide had just turned. I forwarded the recording to Nathan along with a summary of the exchange. He replied in less than 5 minutes. That's the break we needed. That night, I saw something I hadn't expected: a cluster of neighbors gathered on the sidewalk outside my home. Some looked cautious, others concerned. One woman, Denise, from 2 houses down, stepped forward. "We heard about what happened," she said. "Karen's been knocking on doors." Trying to spin the story, added another man, arms crossed. I nodded. They're desperate. A tall man I'd never met before, Raymond, from the newer part of the development, stepped up. "What can we do?" It stunned me for a moment. Weeks of isolation, of feeling like I was screaming into a void, and now voices, presence, support. I invited them inside. 7 of us sat around the dining room table as I explained what Nathan had discovered, what the evidence showed, how Karen had been positioning homes for redevelopment by harassing owners into leaving. I showed them documents, charts, files. I watched disbelief bloom into anger, and anger turn into something more powerful, resolve. By the end of the night, we agreed to meet again. To form a subcommittee not recognized by the HOA, but formed by homeowners tired of being silenced. We would gather stories, collect evidence, share strategies. We were done being alone. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I didn't feel like I was defending my home. I felt like I was protecting ours. I went to bed that night and dreamed of roots. Deep, tangled, defiant roots that refused to be dug out. And in the morning, the sign was back. This property is under review. But this time, I didn't tear it out. I let it stay. Because if they wanted a spotlight, I was ready to stand in it. I never used to be the type to wait patiently. In my younger days, I believed in solving problems with speed efficiency action, forward momentum. But this battle, this war over my own front porch, was teaching me the subtle strength of silence, of timing, of letting your opponent believe they've won long enough to step straight into their own downfall. After Karen's unannounced visit and the quiet uprising it sparked among my neighbors, something shifted not just outside, but inside me. I stopped reacting. I started planning. The sign they'd posted on my lawn stayed right where it was. Every time I glanced at it through the window, I felt something close to satisfaction. Let them keep broadcasting their malice to the block. The more visible their tactics became, the more people began to question them. A few days later, I got a call from Denise, the woman who had first stepped up outside my house. She told me that after our impromptu meeting, she'd reviewed her own HOA correspondence from the past 2 years and found 3 citations with falsified photos ones that weren't even of her property. "You were right," she said, her voice shaking. "They're manufacturing violations." She wasn't alone. Raymond found a fee from last year listed under a code that didn't exist in the HOA charter. George, the elderly man, up the street discovered he'd been charged maintenance assessments during months when no services were performed. It wasn't just harassment, it was systemic, coordinated. Nathan called again. "I've got auditors reviewing their books," he said. "Your documentation helps speed things up. I'm also issuing a preservation of records order. That means if they start shredding files or deleting emails, now we've got them on obstruction." "Do you think they'll realize what's happening?" I asked. "They won't until they hear a knock on their door." I smiled for the first time in days. Still, I kept my movements quiet. I didn't attend the next HOA meeting, nor did I challenge the board in public. Instead, I listened, observed. My front-facing cameras picked up Derek, making 2 late-night visits to homes on my street, placing notices in mailboxes, and act strictly against USPS regulations. I saved the footage and sent it to Nathan. And when I noticed a pair of unfamiliar sedans parked down the street idling for hours with tinted windows and no plates, I noted the time date and even walked past one of them, casually snapping a photo with my phone as I passed. They were watching me, but they were nervous now. The next incident came almost comically. A small drone hovered over my backyard one morning while I was sipping coffee on the porch. It buzzed like a fly, dipping low enough to make me stand. I waved at it with a slow, deliberate hand. The next morning, I installed a privacy canopy over the entire patio and sent a cease and desist letter to the HOA's general email address, referencing the Federal Aviation Administration's privacy regulations. I copied Nathan. Then I went back inside and kept sipping my coffee. Every move I made now was precise, calculated. I wasn't just protecting myself, I was building a foundation that would hold up in court, in public opinion, in state records. 2 days later, something miraculous happened. A young couple I didn't know, Eli and Madison, from the new development cul-de-sac, knocked on my door. They were holding hands, nervous. "We heard what's been happening," Madison said. "And we got this yesterday." She handed me a bright orange citation, pet waste violation. They didn't own a pet. "That's how it starts," I said, folding the paper gently. "How many more of these have you gotten?" 3 in the past 2 months, Eli said. "We didn't think anything of it until a neighbor mentioned your name. I invited them in. We talked. They joined the growing subcommittee we'd formed, unofficial but determined. We now had 13 members each with stories, files, and timelines of their own. I built a shared drive, organized documents into categories, assigned every violation, a tag fabricated, unvoted amendment, excessive fee, threatening language. It felt like constructing a criminal case, and in many ways, it was. Nathan warned me not to let my guard down. Karen knows something's coming, he said. And people like her, they lash out when cornered. I asked if charges were imminent. We're close, he replied. We've traced nearly $78,000 in unaccounted HOA funds over a 24-month period. That alone is enough for state-level financial misconduct. Add in the coercion, the false citations, the lien stacking. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. But then something unexpected happened. Karen went quiet. No new notices, no patrols, no meetings. The next HOA newsletter was suspiciously thin, containing nothing but a reminder about trash pickup hours and a recipe for blueberry muffins. It was eerie, too quiet, the calm before the real storm. I spent that week reinforcing my legal records. I met with a local attorney Nathan recommended to review my options in civil court once the criminal case progressed. I bought 2 backup drives and stored everything twice on the cloud on hardware in physical copies tucked in 3 different places in my home. Then one afternoon I received an envelope. Plain no HOA letterhead, hand-delivered. Inside was a single sheet of paper. If you drop this, we'll make it stop. No more letters, no more notices. You'll have your peace back. There was no signature. Just those 2 sentences typed in a clean serif font. I read it 3 times. Then I laughed. I laughed so hard I had to sit down. Because they still didn't understand. They thought I wanted peace. What I wanted, what I needed, was truth, was justice. And it was coming for them faster than they could imagine. That night, I stood on my back patio watching the dusk settle over Silver Pines. The breeze was warm, but a storm front was rolling in, literal and figurative. I could feel it in the pressure change and the crackle behind the clouds. Tomorrow, Nathan would deliver subpoenas. By the end of the week, the HOA's financials would be reviewed by the state. And by the end of this story, mine and theirs, everyone would know exactly what Karen and her empire had done. I didn't want revenge. I wanted exposure. Because sunlight, I had learned, is the only thing that kills mold. The knock came just after 9 a.m. on Friday. I'd been expecting it not at my door, but a few streets down at the HOA clubhouse. Nathan had told me the timing the night before, 10 sharp. Uniformed officers, certified delivery. Make sure your cameras are rolling. I was standing in my living room, mug in hand, watching the live feed from my front-facing camera when the patrol SUV pulled up, lights flashing, no siren. Just presence. Authority. A second vehicle followed behind, unmarked, but carrying what I knew were investigators from the state attorney's office. And leading the team, stepping out in a suit pressed sharp enough to cut glass, was my cousin Nathan Caldwell. I couldn't help but smile. He didn't look my way, didn't even acknowledge the camera I had aimed at the sidewalk, but I knew that every step he took toward that HOA building was a step on my behalf, and on behalf of every homeowner who had been bullied, lied to, manipulated, and violated. For all their arrogance, the HOA had never imagined someone like me could bring them down, and they certainly never imagined I had family like him. Across the neighborhood, garage doors cracked open as curious residents peeked out. Cars idled at the corners. People who had been too afraid to speak now stood on their porches, watching silently as Nathan entered the HOA office with 2 officers behind him, and returned 10 minutes later with Karen Bellamy in handcuffs. Yes, handcuffs. It was surreal. Karen didn't scream. She didn't protest. She walked stiffly, chin high, like someone still convinced this was all a misunderstanding. But her eyes darted fast and nervous, and I caught the flicker of disbelief on her face as she was escorted past the growing crowd. Behind her came Derek, the compliance officer, pale as drywall. He wasn't cuffed yet, but he was flanked by 2 agents and carrying a box full of files. A third officer locked the front doors of the HOA building and taped a state investigation in progress notice across the glass. I opened my own front door slowly. Neighbors began to gather near the street, small clusters of murmuring, stunned faces. Denise and Raymond appeared at my driveway. George, cane in hand, made his way up from the sidewalk. No one said anything for a while. We just stood there, a neighborhood reborn in silence, watching the regime that had ruled us for years collapse in real time. Then someone started clapping. It was Madison, the young woman from the cul-de-sac, who'd shown me her pet violation. Eli joined in. Then Denise, then the rest. And I didn't clap. I just stood there, hands in my pockets, letting the moment wash over me. Justice wasn't supposed to be cinematic, but sometimes, damn it, it was. Later that day, Nathan came by this time, Not in a suit, but in jeans and a polo, like the cousin I used to ride bikes with through Georgia summers. I met him at the porch with 2 cold beers. "Long time coming," I said, handing him one. He sat down in the chair beside me, exhaled long and slow. "We've got enough to indict Karen on 6 counts of financial fraud, 2 counts of coercion, and 1 of falsifying public documents. And Derek." "He's going to talk," Nathan said. "He's scared. We're offering a deal in exchange for full transparency about how the board operated." I nodded, staring out at the street. Silver Pines looked different already. Less watched, less judged. "I underestimated you," Nathan added. I turned to him. "Because I'm older, retired, quiet. Because you made them think you were alone," he said. "You let them show the world who they really were." I chuckled. That was the plan. We sat in companionable silence for a while, the way people do when there's nothing left to prove. Eventually, he stood. "I'm heading back," he said. "But keep everything you've collected. We'll need you to testify when the time comes." "I will." He paused at the top step. "You're not just keeping your home, Will. You helped take down an entire corrupt system." I watched him walk away, pride swelling in my chest, not just because of what we'd done, but because we'd done it right. No screaming matches, no threats, just truth, strategy, and relentless refusal to be broken. Over the next few days, news trucks came. Local channels ran stories. HOA president arrested in alleged fraud scheme. Homeowners speak out, a neighborhood divided by power. I gave a short interview standing beside my mailbox wearing a worn denim shirt and telling them calmly, "We're not anti-HOA. We're anti-abuse. There's a difference." And people listened. Other neighborhoods began reaching out, some nearby, some in different counties. Their own stories, their own Karens. I created an online group where homeowners could share documents, experiences, strategies. In less than a week, we had over 300 members. The subcommittee in Silver Pines formalized itself, voted in new leadership, and passed a motion to remove 5 remaining board members by community vote. I declined the offer to run for president. I didn't need a title. I already had what I came for: my home, my dignity, and a name that no longer trembled under someone else's rules. I kept the cameras up. Not because I was afraid, but because I remembered. And remembering is what keeps it from happening again. The week after Karen's arrest was unlike anything I'd ever experienced in my life. And that includes burying my wife, raising my daughter alone, and running a business through 2 recessions. Nothing quite compares to watching an entire system unravel, especially one that tried to evict you from your own home. It started with the subpoenas. Nathan sent out official notices to every current and former member of the HOA board. Not just Karen and Derek, but also Barbara Milton, the treasurer, Charles Reese, secretary, and even 2 neighborhood residents who had served short stints on the committee and quietly stepped down months before the investigation began. No one was left untouched. According to Nathan, the paper trail was damning. There were kickbacks, he said bluntly over the phone. Contracts signed to shell companies registered under Derek's cousin's name. Landscaping fees billed to the HOA that were double market price and then funneled into private accounts. You weren't just being harassed, you were financing their greed. I felt sick to my stomach, but I also felt vindicated. That night, I opened my binder, the one I started on that first day they cited me for a garden hose violation. I flipped through each page, each photograph, each timestamped letter, and realized that what I had built wasn't just evidence. It was truth. In an age where power so often wins by distorting reality, I had refused to let mine be rewritten. The state attorney's office held a town hall in Silver Pines 2 days later. It wasn't mandatory, but word spread fast. By sunset, the community center was filled, standing room only. I hadn't seen half of these people outside in years. Some I'd passed at mailbox rows for years without so much as a nod. But now they were nodding at me, grateful, embarrassed, some ashamed they hadn't spoken up sooner. Nathan stepped up to the podium. I watched him with quiet pride as he laid it all out: the fraudulent citations, the misuse of fines, the attempt to evict me in order to push through a land acquisition plan involving a developer who was also now under federal scrutiny. He didn't embellish. He didn't need to. The truth was enough to make jaws drop. Then he did something I didn't expect. He called my name. None of this, he said, would have come to light if one homeowner hadn't stood his ground, if he hadn't documented everything, if he hadn't believed that silence is complicity and decided to speak out anyway. Will Delaney, on behalf of the state of Georgia, thank you. The room erupted into applause. I didn't know what to do with my hands. I stood, nodded slightly, then sat back down. Carla texted me minutes later. I'm crying at my desk. So proud of you, Dad. That weekend I got letters, real ones, handwritten, from neighbors. One from George, the older gentleman who'd nearly lost his home. You reminded me that we have a right to be here. Thank you for helping me feel safe again. One from Denise. You weren't just brave. You were methodical. That's what saved us. Even Raymond wrote, I used to think HOA drama was just noise. You proved it could be deadly serious and that someone has to push back. The weight of those words landed somewhere deep in my ribs. Because here's the truth, I hadn't planned to be anyone's hero. I was just trying to keep my home. But sometimes standing still in the storm makes you the lighthouse everyone else was waiting for. The legal process continued. Karen was formally charged with multiple counts of wire fraud, abuse of office, and falsification of public documents. She pled not guilty, of course, but the evidence kept piling up. I testified before the grand jury. So did Derek, though his testimony came with the deal, one that helped unravel even deeper misconduct. We discovered they had targeted single homeowners disproportionately. They'd even tried to force elderly residents into early sales, preying on people who didn't have family around to defend them. There were spreadsheets. There were charts. There were audio recordings, some of which I had captured myself, including Karen's front porch visit and her threat-laced offer to make everything go away if I vacated the home. And when the judge reviewed the materials, he said something I'll never forget. While this is not simply a case of civil overreach, it is a story of systemic abuse and the weaponization of bureaucracy against the very people it was meant to serve. Let that sink in. Weaponization of bureaucracy. That's what it was. HOA guidelines twisted into threats. Rules turned into traps, fines transformed into revenue streams, and behind it all, people like Karen who wore power like a polished brooch but wielded it like a blade. But not anymore. The judge denied her bail. As the legal reckoning continued, Silver Pines transformed. The temporary board, now run by homeowners who had previously been silenced, began reversing unfair citations. They returned thousands in misappropriated fines to residents. They changed the HOA bylaws to require full community vote for any amendment. They even instituted term limits and mandatory transparency protocols. One afternoon, as I walked past the community pool, I saw something that made me stop in my tracks. Two kids, maybe 12 or 13, were taping handmade signs to the fence. Community BBQ Saturday, free for all neighbors. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it felt possible again. We were rebuilding, not just a neighborhood, but a sense of shared humanity. And yes, I knew justice wasn't over. Karen still had to face trial. There were more depositions, more hearings, and the scars she left behind on me on others would take time to fade. But the tide had turned. The system had snapped, and the sound of that breaking was the most beautiful thing I'd heard in years. The collapse didn't come with sirens and flames. It came with paper, certified letters, formal resignations, court orders, and then silence. It started with Barbara Milton, the HOA treasurer. After Karen's arrest, she went underground, no meetings, no emails, no responses to community inquiries. But Nathan had already subpoenaed her financial records, and what he uncovered painted a picture even uglier than we expected. Barbara had personally authorized over $30,000 in landscaping reimbursements to a company called Pine Glow Maintenance. Problem was, Pine Glow didn't exist, not in any registry, not in any tax documents, not even as a placeholder LLC. It was a ghost company. The real kicker, the bank account listed on the reimbursement forms was in Barbara's name. She folded within days. Barbara agreed to cooperate with the state in exchange for a reduced sentence. Her testimony was the final nail in the coffin for Karen, and a cascade of dominoes began to fall. Charles Reese, the HOA secretary, resigned by email at 3 a.m. one Tuesday morning. No apology, no explanation, just a quiet exit and a statement that he was stepping away to prioritize his health. That same day, his house was listed for sale. I noticed the for sale sign out front had no HOA logo. That told me everything I needed to know. He was running, and fast. Derek, the ever-watchful compliance officer, tried to disappear too. But the problem with being the foot soldier of a corrupt operation is that your footprints are everywhere. Nathan's team traced his vehicle to more than a dozen unauthorized compliance checks conducted without community approval, including nighttime surveillance and mail tampering. He was charged with trespassing and intimidation. And yet, despite all this, there were still people who doubted me. A small handful of residents, those who had cozied up to the old regime, for power or status, claimed I had overreacted, that I had brought unnecessary attention to our quiet little neighborhood. One even had the gall to say, all this just over a few citations. I didn't argue. I didn't need to. Because that same week, the state released a full report, a 47-page public document outlining exactly how the Silver Pines HOA had manipulated, defrauded, and threatened homeowners over the course of 5 years. It included redacted testimonies, financial statements, copies of emails between Karen and Barbara, and worst of all, meeting minutes that showed they had strategized to target vulnerable homeowners. That word hit me like a hammer. Vulnerable. As if we were prey. As if the people who lived quiet lives, paid their dues, and trusted the system were simply stepping stones on their path to power and profit. But the report did more than confirm what we'd already known. It opened the door for civil action. Nathan connected me with a law firm that specialized in class action suits. Within a week, over 40 residents signed on. Damages, restitution, emotional distress, loss of property value. The case was built brick by brick. But I wasn't interested in the money. I was interested in the message. That message arrived ironically in the form of a new HOA charter, one rewritten from scratch by the interim board, based entirely on transparency, accountability, and fairness. The first paragraph read, "Well, the purpose of this association is to protect, not persecute. We serve the homeowners, not the other way around." It was simple, but it was revolutionary. Meanwhile, the property developers who had pushed the board to clear out homeowners like me vanished like smoke. Nathan told me their proposal had been part of a larger plan to build high-end condos across several redevelopment zones in the county, most of which were neighborhoods governed by under-regulated HOAs. Our exposure had triggered a domino effect. 3 other neighborhoods in the state launched independent audits of their own HOAs within 2 weeks of our report. One discovered similar embezzlement patterns. Another found discriminatory enforcement of violations based on race and family structure. It was bigger than Silver Pines. It had always been bigger. But now we weren't just whispers. We were a movement. News outlets picked up the story. The HOA that went too far, when power meets paper trails. I was interviewed 3 more times, but I stopped giving sound bites. I let the facts speak for themselves. Still, I couldn't resist the irony when I walked past the community park once off-limits to me, due to Karen's revocation of privileges, and saw kids playing on the swings again, parents chatting on benches, a barbecue smoker filling the air with the smell of mesquite. I sat down at one of the picnic tables, and no one looked at me sideways. No one flinched. One woman even smiled and asked if I'd like a burger. That small moment told me more than any report ever could. We weren't afraid anymore. Karen's trial was scheduled for the fall. She remained in custody after being denied bail again due to flight risk and obstruction concerns. I would testify, as would Nathan, Barbara, Derek, and nearly 24 homeowners. It wouldn't be easy. She still had lawyers, still had people claiming she'd been misunderstood, that the pressure had gotten to her, that she was trying her best. But I wasn't going to let them rewrite the story, because I'd lived it. I knew what it felt like to be alone. To come home and find your world unraveling because someone behind a desk had decided you didn't belong anymore. And I knew what it felt like to stand up anyway. At the next community meeting, the new board asked me to speak. I stood behind the same podium Karen once used, looking out at the same rows of metal chairs she once ruled with her perfectly manicured fist. I cleared my throat. When I moved here, I thought I was buying peace, I said. Turns out I had to fight for it. People chuckled softly, nodded. But what I learned is that real peace doesn't come from rules, it comes from trust. And trust, once broken, takes time to rebuild. But it can be rebuilt. We're living proof of that. I paused, looked around the room. Familiar faces, softer eyes. We've been through hell, I said. But we came out of it with something rare: community. Not just homes next to each other, but people willing to stand for each other. There was applause. Not loud, not frenzied, but steady, solid, earned. As I stepped down from the podium, I realized something that made me stop halfway to my seat. I wasn't just a survivor anymore. I was a neighbor again. The house felt different now. Not because anything had physically changed, though I had finally replaced the dented mailbox and painted over the holes where Karen's eviction notice had once been nailed. No, it was something deeper. A shift in the way the walls seemed to breathe, the way sunlight stretched across the floor each morning like it was finally welcome. The silence no longer felt suffocating. It felt sacred, safe. I'd reclaimed my home. But more than that, I'd reclaimed my voice, and that I learned was something even harder to defend. I remember the first time I truly felt free again. It wasn't during the legal victories or the interviews or the town hall applause. It was a Sunday morning a few weeks after the new HOA charter had been adopted. I stepped out onto my porch with a cup of coffee sat in the rocker Carla and I had built years ago and simply existed without looking over my shoulder. No surveillance car idling across the street. No HOA compliance clipboard circling my fence line. No orange notices screaming from the front door. Just me and a blue sky and birdsong. It felt like exhaling after holding my breath for months. But peace, I realized, is not something you inherit. It's something you defend. And not just for yourself. When the trial began in the fall, I took the stand with more than just evidence. I took every word they'd tried to use to silence me, and I spoke them back louder, clearer with context. The citations, the threats, the faked bylaws, the fake developer deals, the late-night letters. I recounted it all with dates with proof and with the calm fury of someone who had once been pushed to the edge and decided not to jump. Karen sat across the courtroom in a navy blue suit flanked by 2 defense attorneys. She didn't look at me once. I didn't need her to, because every person on that jury could see what she'd tried to do, what her board had enabled, what silence had allowed. When Nathan cross-examined Derek and Barbara, I saw the room shift. Their testimonies were damning, but it was the quiet, tired honesty in their voices that landed hardest. "I didn't think we'd get caught," Barbara said. "And when we did, I didn't think anyone would believe a retired man over a board." I didn't flinch, because once upon a time, I hadn't believed it either. But now we all did. The verdict came faster than any of us expected. Guilty on all counts. Karen would serve time. Restitution was ordered. The judge even recommended that further HOA regulations be reviewed at the state level. It wasn't just about punishing her anymore. It was about preventing the next one. And I walked out of that courthouse lighter than I'd felt in years. Not triumphant. Just steady, solid, whole. Months passed. Silver Pines transformed. The new board launched a community garden project. The subcommittee I helped form evolved into an advisory panel for neighboring districts. I received speaking invitations from homeowner groups, housing watchdogs, even small city councils, asking how to prevent another Karen situation. At first, I declined them all. But one afternoon, I received an email from a woman named Linda in a small Florida neighborhood. It was short, just 3 lines. "They're trying to evict me. I live alone. I have no family. I don't know what to do. But I saw your story." I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I wrote back. And when she responded, I helped her outline her first formal complaint. I connected her with someone in her state. I sent her my old binder index and walked her through the steps I took. 2 months later, she sent me a photo of her standing on her front lawn with a sign that read, "Not afraid anymore." I cried. I never thought a fight over a garden hose would ripple into someone else's life hundreds of miles away. But that's the thing about voices. When one speaks up, it gives permission to the next, and the next. That's how change happens. Not in courtrooms, not in breaking news alerts, but in quiet, private decisions to stop being silent. Carla came home for the holidays that year. She stepped onto the porch and turned in a slow circle, taking in everything with that look only children can give, the kind that sees beyond paint and lawn and siding into the story of a place. "It feels different," she said, setting down her suitcase. "Like the house is breathing again." I nodded. "It is." We spent that evening in the backyard stringing lights through the garden. The same garden they once used to justify evicting me. The same space they tried to turn into proof of my noncompliance. Now it was blooming. Fully. Proudly. A patch of defiance in full color. Carla poured 2 glasses of wine. You know you could write a book. I already wrote it, I said with a small smile. In court filings. She laughed. Fair enough. We toasted quietly, just the two of us. And for once, there were no cameras, no citations, no shadows. Just peace. Hard-earned, battle-tested, real. I don't tell this story because I enjoy reliving it. I tell it because someone else, somewhere, might be walking out to their mailbox today and finding a letter that doesn't make sense. They might be staring at fines they didn't deserve. They might be standing in front of a home they paid for, wondering why they suddenly feel like an outsider in their own life. To that person, I say this. Document everything. Trust your gut. And never ever let them scare you into silence. Because if they came for me and I won, they can't stop you either. You are not alone. Not anymore.